Today we're going to be talking about persuasive speaking. It's very much similar to informative speaking, but you'll have a different goal in mind. Instead of trying to inform your audience members about a certain topic, you are now trying to persuade them about some issue or to take some action in some way or to do something differently in their life. So let's take a look at how this is done. Today we're going to talk about how ethics impacts your persuasion. Ethics is one of the first and foremost considerations when building a speech, especially of a persuasive nature. How to design your persuasive main points, how you're going to write these like claims or arguments, and how to develop support for each of your persuasive topics. So every issue you may want to tackle has very specific support that you may need to cover, and you may also need to look at opposing sides of the issues. I'm also going to talk about how to link evidence to reasoning today, because sometimes it may seem very clear to you as the researcher or somebody who's interested in this topic, but to your audience, it may not seem as clear. So sometimes you have to actually make the connection to the listeners as to what your evidence means to the reasoning. So let's talk about that. So your goals must be ethically sound. Like I said earlier, it's really the foremost consideration when it comes to persuasion. Communication, as you've already learned, has a lot of impact on people and has a lot of influence. When you go to persuade, you then increase that impact and that influence even more so. So you've got to make sure your goals are ethically sound. And what I mean by that is that you're talking your audience into doing something that's good for them. You would never want to ask them to start using a supplement that hasn't been tested yet and that we don't know about and just making some claims about it. Because then anything that could happen to somebody, that might be negative would be your fault, basically. So you've got to be very careful about the goal that you choose for your persuasive arguments. You also want to talk them into something that is going to be good for society. We'll talk about how it should fold out so that it's good for this one person, but it's also good for a multitude of people or good for the people around them. That also shows ethics. You should be fully prepared for your speech. I know this is an interesting part of ethics, but it's actually something that listeners look for, and they will take away credibility from you if they don't feel like you're prepared for your speech. So it's important for your informative speech, of course, to be prepared, but it's even more so important to be prepared for your persuasive speech. If you come in, you're rushed, you look stressed, you look like you don't know what's going on, you're not sure of your visual aid, you're messing with your note cards, no one's really going to have a lot of confidence in what you have to say, and that can really impact you not achieving your goal as well. Balance the emotional and logical appeals. Audience members are persuaded by emotions more than logic, but yet logical appeals must be there in order for us to really make some decision-making changes in our life. So a good way to do this is to just blend them. A lot of times your logical appeals will be backed up by statistical and numerical and factual data, while your emotional appeals might have more qualitative information. So for instance, an emotional appeal for something like a persuasive speech on organ donation, an emotional appeal would have a specific person probably in mind, going through what this person goes through. Maybe it's a 6-year-old boy and he doesn't have a functioning liver, and you may talk about what he goes through day to day, some of the pain he suffers, some of the treatments that he has to go through, some of the side effects that he experiences. That's going to have some emotional weight for us. Your logical appeals may be more statistical or numerically related. So telling us how many 6-year-olds have this kind of cancer, how many kids under 10 experience a life-threatening cancer or have to wait for an organ to be donated. You can basically go out there and find the research that then lets you build this emotional appeal and lets you build these logical appeals. You don't want to ignore any other side of the issue. You never want to go into a speech and just try to pretend and put your blinders up that other opposing thoughts don't exist. So let's say with the organ donation speech, for instance, there are some myths out there that if you're going to give a good organ donation speech, you may have to tackle. For instance, there is a myth that I've heard that you couldn't have an open casket funeral if you're an organ donor. And you should look this up. Research shows that, of course, you can have an open casket funeral being an organ donor. They're very careful about the organ removal process, and they respect that. Another myth is that doctors won't work on you. They'll let you die so that they can harvest your organs. These are myths I've heard. I'm not making these up. That, of course, is untrue. You can see that doctors usually don't even know that you're an organ donor until after you've coded, or there's some other sort of life-threatening thing going on until they're looking at that. So, and there really hasn't been any support for that not happening, that doctors still respond to the person in the ER the same way, regardless of organ donation. So you may want to handle some of those myths if there's something surrounding your topic. It may not be a myth. Let's take the issue of gun control. There are arguments for both sides of that issue. Regardless of how you feel personally, you have to handle your audience making a decision through both sides of that. So there's the issue of safety, there's the issue of personal protection, there's the issue of the freedom or the right to bear arms. You've got to look at all sides of that issue and really make sure you unpack it equally so that your audience is then led through a fair argument. They will pick up very quickly if it's an unfair or a biased argument, and you're not going to be able to persuade them very easily with that. So you want to write your persuasive main points as full, complete sentences. They're always going to be like a full statement. And you need to make a claim or an argument with these persuasive main points. If I was going to give you a speech about organ donation, maybe my first main point might be, there are many reasons that you should donate organs. Underneath that main point, I would then unpack all the reasons, because all the people that pass away needing an organ, because of the fact that you don't need it any longer. There could be a number of reasons that I bring up and support that I make in that claim. You also then need to prove it and use any kind of language that would then help you prove or help you shape the audience's mind about this topic. So if you're talking about maybe a toxic chemical that can be found in some of our perfumes or our makeup or our deodorants, then you want to talk about that as a toxic chemical, as this killer chemical, or this biotoxic, or this murderous chemical. You can even start to use language that's vivid and imaginative in a way in your persuasive speech that you're not really able to do so in your informative speech. You can now add the value that you may feel into the language, even if you have to represent an unbiased side, even if you've got to talk about all sides of an issue. You might use Monroe's motivated sequence. I won't spend a lot of time talking about that here, but if you're in my class, you'll be required to use Monroe's motivated sequence, and your textbook does a great job of breaking down what this is. It basically gives you a formula or a recipe to follow to write your main points in a persuasive speech. So when you're supporting persuasion, your research material is really vital. Without it, you're not able to prove any of the claims that you're making. You're just up there making claims and making arguments and not really getting anything done. So prove every single statement you make with your backed up research. If you tell me that, kids dying without organs is a real issue in the United States, back it right up with the research. You need to use evidence and actually link that sometimes to logical reasoning. You should review, excuse me, you should review the fallacies in reasoning in your textbook, because you want to avoid those fallacies. Things such as bandwagoning or the red herring. Look those up so you're familiar with those, and make sure you're not doing those in your speeches. We'll talk more about those in class, but if you're not in my class by chance, you do want to look those up and be very familiar. There's ways of making logical reasoning, and then there's reasoning fallacies. Be familiar with both. So in summary, your persuasive goals for your speech should be ethical, and they should be reasonable. They should be something you can actually ask your audience to do. And they should be sustainable. And when I say that, I mean something that's good for the person and also good for the surrounding environment or their community. The use of your source data is critical, so you'll need to verbally cite your sources, and you'll need to use source data throughout your speech to really prove that your claims are true and give us a reason to believe your arguments.